Okay, well, how do we assess Australia's presence in the world? Gareth Evans and Bruce Grant wrote a book back in 1995 entitled Australia's Foreign Relations. And in that book, they made this statement: Australia is a middle power. We are manifestly not a great power or even a major power, nor, however, are we small or insignificant. So this notion that we think of ourselves as a middle power, we know we're not as big and as powerful as the United States or Russia or China or the European Union, but neither are we insignificant. That's, I think, the general belief. So what is a middle power? I want to ask that question. What do we mean by a middle power in international politics? And just today, in fact, I was sent an article to review for an international journal called Geopolitics, and the article is on middle powers, and I came across this definition, and I thought I'd share it with you this evening. The writers of this paper said, a middle power is one that's possessing mid-range levels of power, somewhere between major and small powers. Now, that didn't help me or anybody else for that matter. And in fact, because I was reviewing it anonymously, as is the way of these journals, I couldn't say, you should go and read my book. But in my book, I've argued that, in fact, there are three ways of talking about middle powers. The first is what I refer to as dependent middle powers. Dependent middle powers are states like Australia, like Canada, perhaps like New Zealand, that need alliances with, as Sir Robert Menzies once put it, great and powerful friends. We're insecure if we don't have a strong alliance with a great power. And building on that alliance, we begin to have a certain degree of, we think at least, that we have a certain degree of influence and significance in regional and global affairs. But our middle power claims, or the status of middle powerdom in that particular case, is utterly related to the alliance that the middle power has with a great power. So dependent middle powers are the first kind of middle powers that I talk about, and I'll be arguing in a moment that Australia is a middle power, a dependent middle power. Then there are what I call regional middle powers, and these are states that come together in groupings, regional groupings, and outside those regional groupings, they're insignificant. They don't have much power or influence, but when they join in a regional grouping, for example, the European Union, or another example closer to home, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and ASEAN is meeting in in Sydney this coming weekend, heads of state are. These regional groupings give states certain gravitas, certain influence that they would not otherwise have. And I think it's very interesting now watching Britain go through the terrible contortions of Brexit. Within the European Union, Britain is quite a significant regional middle power. Outside Europe, it becomes a dependent middle power because it's going to have to turn to the United States. And a dependent middle power, I want to suggest to you, is inferior to a regional middle power. But the third, and I think the best kind of middle power, is what I call middle powers as global citizens. These are states that can be quite small in terms of their populations, in terms of their economies, but have a remarkable, what I want to call ethical or moral influence in global affairs. For example, Norway. It's got around 6 million people. It's got a record on human rights issues, second to none in the European context and in the United Nations. It has been a leading state in the United Nations and elsewhere in promoting nuclear weapons non-proliferation. And it's also been a major human rights advocate. And it was one of the states, one of the most important states, in pushing the military junta in Burma to begin the grudging reforms that they've been going through over the last few years. So Norway is, for me, an example of a small country punching way above its weight and having an influence that makes it a global citizen in international affairs. So there are these three kinds of middle powers. Dependent, I think, are the most inferior, if you like, kinds of middle powers, regional middle powers, and middle powers as global citizens. In a sense, I think dependent middle powers and regional middle powers aren't real middle powers anyway, because their reliance is on alliances rather than on substantive actual power that they have themselves, you see. But unfortunately, I think particularly dependent middle powers have the tendency to think that they're much more important, much more significant, even superior to many other states than they really are.